First things first, Ajamu, thank you for coming on the program and taking the time to sit down with me.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course, a lot of people have been saying Russia's war in Ukraine backfired. They brought NATO together. Condoleezza Rice was saying that she's never seen NATO more united. Do you think that's true? Do you think that Russia inadvertently caused this, or they were going to join NATO anyway? Because on the flip side, you could argue that, NATO expanded by 14 countries since the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So which side do you think is stronger in their argument?
In terms of the argument that this event resulted in this unprecedented unity of NATO. On the surface, that of course is a line, but we are seeing that NATO is not as solid on its positions vis-a-vis Ukraine and this war as it pretends to be. There are real cracks because there are contrary and actually contradictory interests in play here. That basically this war in Ukraine and the sanction regime imposed on Russia is turning out to be more of an imposition on various European economies and the world for that fact. But for on the European economies and actually Russia. Now, there's no doubt that there's serious problems and suffering in Russia as a consequence of the sanctions. But on top of the inflation issue in Western Europe and the U.S., the issues around the coronavirus and the collapse of the economy in 2008 and 2009 that people really never recovered from. This situation with Ukraine has deepened the contradictions in those countries. So no, I don't see NATO as a unified alliance. I see some real contradictions between Russia, between the Germans and the French. So no, it's not united in any way.
You mentioned sanctions. We're seeing record inflation in the U.S. Gas and food prices are higher in the EU. Aldi, this supermarket chain in Germany, they've raised food prices. Do you think the sanctions are effectively backfiring on the West? What do you think of Biden calling all of this Putin's price hike?
Well, I think it's a very slick PR for him to frame it in that way. But there is a hashtag in social media on Twitter that says, "I blame Biden," because this conflict, many people believe, myself included, could have been completely avoided if the U.S. And its Western allies have been serious about addressing some of the legitimate concerns of the Russians. So this conflict that occurred, that they have been planning and preparing for more than 8 years, it is in fact backfiring on the Biden administration. Is creating a deepening crisis. It is in fact resulting in a global economic crisis for not only people in Western Europe, but around the world with these heightened food prices. I mean, people have to remember that the Russians, for example, are responsible for something like 40% of fertilizer that's exported around the world. So the food prices, gas prices, the people who are suffering the most are in fact the working class, where the bourgeoisie are basically making money hands over fist as always.
What did you think of Putin's move to demand rubles in exchange for gas? Europe gets 40% of its gas. EU member states are among these so-called unfriendly nations that he said must pay in rubles. What did you think of that move?
I think it was something that I think the Western nations didn't really anticipate, but it makes perfect sense that if you freeze the Russians' resources, disallow the central bank from being able to engage in normal and legitimate commercial transactions, for them to demand that these payments are being offered in Russian currency makes sense. Now, whether or not that undermines or goes around the sanctions, that's not really their concern. Their concern is basically they have to operate their economy. For them to be receiving euros and dollars that they can't even convert is basically, as someone said, it's like we're giving away our resources with nothing in return.
We've also seen some other, side effects of this. We've seen China buying coal from the Russians in rubles. We've seen India buying oil in rubles. Discussions between Saudi Arabia and China, perhaps selling oil to China in renminbi as opposed to dollars. Do you think that the West has shot itself in the foot because they've led to decisions that would, effectively undermine Western monetary hegemony?
I think that there are many people who believe that in fact has happened, and I believe that also. I don't believe, though, that we are going to see a complete removal of dollar hegemony anytime soon. But there is a growing momentum toward lessening the dependence on the dollar, something we haven't seen really ever before. So, yeah, their policies have been such that they have undermined confidence in the dollars. And so, yeah, they have these contradictory predatory policies resulting in a real political issue for U.S. capital.
What are your thoughts on countries like China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, more or less half the planet's population, refusing to parrot the Western narrative on Ukraine, Russia? Especially we've seen that in the form of, votes at the UN, either abstentions or no votes when it comes to condemning Russia.
Well, it's very interesting because when you see Western propaganda, they'll talk about the world is taking XYZ position. But normally what they're talking about is the Western world. And what we have seen with these votes, even though they have been successful in terms of the votes, what we've seen is that the vast majority of the population are not in alignment with these policies. So the world is opposed to these policies, and there's a very simple reason for that. Many people in the world in the global South are countries and peoples and movements that have been in the crosshairs of Western colonialism. They have suffered from the consequences of policies from Western colonialism. So they're not going to be that thrilled in attempting and joining with the West as a partisan.
Speaking of the global South, we have big projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia, of course, has allies in its vicinity other than EU member states. Do you think that Ukraine has been sort of a catalyst, or if not a catalyst, it's speeding up the transition to a multipolar world?
I think it is. It's no question that it's already sort of a multipolar world. We are seeing really the beginnings of the end of white world supremacy. You cannot dismiss the fact that the Chinese are a significant force, the Russians are a significant force, India. What is happening, though, is that Western policymakers, in particular the U.S., don't seem to want to understand that conditions have changed, and they want to operate as though instead of it being 2022, that is 2012. But the conditions are such that they have to discover how to operate in the world in which they're not able to dictate anymore, and they're finding that very, very difficult to, in fact, do.
What did you think of someone like Marine Le Pen, this far-right leader in France? She's basically saying that, or she's basically advocating for a diplomatic settlement between NATO and Russia, as opposed to the conventional wisdom right now in the West, which is let's send more weapons.
I think it makes perfect sense. In fact, it's a position that many people who are anti-war activists are taking, that there should have never been an abandonment of a call for a ceasefire and for a negotiated settlement. This ideal that the Ukrainians were going to defeat the Russian military was always fictitious, and it's only elongated the war, increased the suffering. And so what seems like a so-called right-wing position coming from Marine Le Pen is objectively just a common sense position. If one wants to really see a resolution There's not going to be a continuation of the destruction of the Ukrainian economy and the Ukrainian people. So it makes perfect sense. The very fact that it's being framed as some kind of wild and lunatic sort of position, it really just reflects how far to the right Western opinion has really gone.
Can I get your thoughts on
much further than Le Pen?
Yeah, really. It's really interesting to see that. It's true. Speaking of the far right, do you agree that we're seeing some sort of whitewashing in the media, that groups like Right Sector, Azov, which the media openly refer to as Nazis or neo-Nazis, a few months ago, they're now saying, they're just far right elements. What do you think of the media coverage in terms of how powerful these groups are in Ukraine?
The media coverage has been completely irresponsible. And it demonstrates that the U.S. and Western European forces will align with any force that they believe will help them to advance their short-term strategic interests. The idea of moderate neo-Nazis is absurd, but it comes though from a playbook. And we saw that there were moderate jihadists in Syria, for example. So, we have to, one of the lessons that we have learned as members of the African opposition is that there seems to be a basis for a cross-class, multinational, white supremacist coalition that strikes us as very dangerous, because we know that Ukraine became the epicenter of the transnational white supremacist movement, and to dress up these ultra right elements and neo-Nazis to me is a dangerous occurrence, and something that we are never going to forget.
Speaking of white supremacy, what do you think of the difference in coverage between Ukrainian victims and victims of U.S., UK, NATO wars? I mean, I could just take the example. There's a Palestinian woman, a mother of 6. She's a widow, partially, visually impaired. She was shot dead, and I didn't see any coverage of this in the Western press. I only saw coverage of it in the Arab world. What do you think of this disparity between the coverage and this, basically what is a white lives matters movement?
Well, that is a term that I coined that to me is reflective of what we see. That where we have seen surface, in fact, a White Lives Matter more movement. That there's a double standard we always knew existed, but it became absolutely blatant, and something they're not going to be able to explain away very, very well. So yes, that tragic situation was not covered. But the fact that you have people starving in Afghanistan as a consequence of U.S. policies, the ongoing wars that are still occurring across the global South, the destabilization that we see continues in places like Venezuela with these illegal sanctions, and the consequence, meaning that people are dying from these sanctions, it's quite clear that the only lives that really matter are the lives of Western Europeans. So it's not surprising that they will open up their countries and arms to these Ukrainian refugees, while at the same time the Biden administration is engaged in still shipping people back to Haiti. And the Brits have said, if you attempt to come into Britain, they're going to send you back to they're going to send you to Africa. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous.
Yeah, they want to send refugees now to Rwanda.
Right.
If I could just pivot quickly to Elon Musk and Twitter, what do you think that says about the outrage that we're seeing from the neoliberal class, which are suddenly concerned about a billionaire owning social media, as if that's not already the norm? And
exactly, it makes no sense. I mean, they're concerned, and they have really exposed themselves again. They're concerned that if he took control of Twitter, that he would loosen the censorship process that we see on Twitter, and they see that as a threat. These are forces that used to pretend to be the champions of free speech and human rights, but they have been exposed to be the most dangerous elements of the emerging and developing neo-fascist movement in the West. So it's been, again, another example for us of the hypocrisy of liberals and neoliberals, and the danger that this sector really presents to most of us who believe in people-centered human rights, who believe in real democracy, who believe that thoughts should be free and there should be free speech, and who believe that we have a right and responsibility to oppose the policies of governments and not be subjected to the fear that we would be subjected to social death or even criminal prosecution.
Right, and just for context, this comes as, of course, they banned Pepe Escobar, Scott Ritter, I think Russians with Attitude, and RT, of course, on YouTube, and a host of other networks. Do you think that bodes well for free thought in the West?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, we are seeing a real serious neo-fascist thrust, and it's important that we fight back. It's important that we try to win more people to the side of support for democracy and free speech, and that we expose the fact that the driving force of this censorship process, of this new totalitarianism, is in fact the neoliberal right. While they have people's attention focused on the so-called Trumpians and Trump, it is in fact the neoliberal right that is the driving force for the new forms of fascism that's developing in the Western world.
Ajamu, where can people find your work? Where can they follow you online and on social media?
Well, please follow me on Twitter, because they've been attempting to suppress me also. So it's at Ajamu Baraka. And please follow the work that we're doing at the Black Agenda Report that comes out every Wednesday. One of the few places you can get the unvarnished Black radical perspective on the world. And please support the Black Alliance of Peace, an organization that is committed to anti-imperialism and building and making a new world. So please join us, support us, because we have a tremendous fight ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Ajamu. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your brilliant insight.
Thank you so much for inviting me.